Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you turning out to join us for our opening roundtable, which will be the start of a 2-day workshop that we will be engaging in to talk about the legacies of war pollution. Many of the speakers will be focusing on landmines and unexploded ordnance. Others will be talking about chemical toxins, most obviously dioxin, but other forms of chemical warfare, and how people in the decades that follow recreate their lives to the best of their ability, the cascading effects on not only their descendants, but also on animal species and the ecosystems in which they live. So what we're going to do today, I think, for the audience is to give you a sort of a little taste of what to come. We're going to have a number of our participants do some reflecting on their own research as it relates to the overarching themes of the workshop. Because the stage is small, we're going to go in 2 shifts. I'm going to introduce our first 3 panelists, and then they're going to step down, and I'm going to invite the next ones up, and we're going to repeat the same process. And then once we've done so, we hope to have an interesting conversation, both with questions and just regular conversation about the ideas, and there'll be plenty of time and scope for those of you in the audience to pose your own questions. And of course, someone will be monitoring the chat box, I think, online. So if you want to raise any questions online, please do so. Don't hesitate to do so. Okay? Just by means of introduction, my name is Ken McLean. I'm a professor at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the United States, and I'm one of the 3 co-organizers of the conference. The other one is Damngo, who I'll say more about in a moment, and Tat Nguyen, who's sitting here in front, and you'll see him shortly as well. So thank you, Niad, and everyone who made this possible. All right. Pardon me, I'm old, I need to read. All right, we are going to go in reverse order. Our first speaker will be Adriana Petrana. She is a professor in anthropology and directs the MD, PhD program in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. Her work on biological citizenship, ethical variability, and experimentality have advanced critical social science study of environmental disasters, most notably Chernobyl, biomedical research, and the study of global health. Her most recent book, Horizon Work at the Edges of Knowledge and in the Age of Runaway Climate Change. I broke it already. All right. Examines the climate crisis through the lens of horizoning, a mode of reckoning she describes that considers unnatural disasters against horizons of expectation in which people and societies can still act. I believe today she will be talking about nuclear issues, correct?
Okay. Thank you, Ken, for the introduction. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Dot. Thank you all for organizing this really important set of events and for letting me speak about issues in Ukraine. And I'll be focused mainly on nuclear issues. So a few days into the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russian military captured Ukraine's Chernobyl nuclear facility. It's largely defunct. Why would the Russian military want it? The blast at reactor number 4 in 1986 sent radioactive fallout across Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and other parts of the world. It resulted in a largely depopulated exclusion zone, an area that extends over 2,500 square kilometers around the destroyed plant. The occupation of Chernobyl, which the filmmaker Alexei Radinsky chronicled in detail in his important documentary, Chernobyl 22, would portend a nuclear warfare without bombs if the plant was shelled or tampered with. With its ongoing Russian occupation, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, the largest in Europe, has been subject to repeated shelling with potentially grave consequences. And even as Article 56 of the Geneva Conventions outlaws attacks on nuclear electrical generating stations, we now know that nuclear warfare without bombs is real, which raises questions about how critical infrastructure is being enlisted to produce deadly conditions of life. It's of vital importance that the safe and secure operations of nuclear facilities in Ukraine should not be affected or disrupted in any way. These were the words of Rafael Grossi, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, who's been working to offset the risk of disaster at Zaporizhzhia. But what does it mean to maintain safe operations when those being held hostage, including workers conducting nuclear plant operations, are doing so under duress and active military occupation, even at gunpoint? I wonder whether international rules have caught up to a world in which environmental weaponization and terror have become a key feature of war. What does it mean to maintain safe operations when the reality of doing so occurs within the context of a war crime? So I raise these questions in my paper for the workshop, which is about the paradoxes and loopholes that make this war into a planetary war. And I approach questions of accountability and just response as an anthropologist with connections to Ukraine and as someone writing about the climate crisis. In an earlier book, Life Exposed: Biological Citizens After Chernobyl, I chronicled the meltdown and radiation damage at Chernobyl based on interviews with scores of emergency cleanup workers, among others, who labored to contain this catastrophe's effects. The impact of their work went far beyond immediate location. And as someone who knew their histories, it is remarkable to this day how the global environmental impacts of their work largely disappeared from the story of the disaster's containment, which was largely focused on things like the steel Chernobyl safe confinement cover, rather than the people who went there, either voluntarily or by force, to physically contain the disaster. Thousands of them faced premature death and disease while providing physical cover for the rest of the world. I'm concerned that as IAEA missions focus on inspections, events on the ground are being normalized. A recent open source assessment commissioned by Greenpeace said as much, that international regulators are unable to properly monitor the Zaporizhzhia site. I'm also thinking about horizons of accountability, how they are made, deferred, or lost in this crisis, as if a situation of nuclear terror can be tamed back into something that can be adjudicated through a safety standard. To be sure, the Geneva Conventions on the Laws of War have not stopped the routine targeting of civilians or torture, be it in Iraq, Vietnam, Syria, or elsewhere. But how did this particular scenario, in which a disconnect between nuclear safety regimes and the open hostilities that undermine them, unfold? Are we beyond some tipping point where standards and rules are gone? And perhaps all that is left is a ritual of safety? Which brings me back to the people who are at the moment doing the actual work of minimizing risk. When I did my work with Chernobyl cleanup workers, I did so as Cold War militarism supposedly ended. Their desperate efforts to secure some form of health care and political recognition from the state took place under the most extreme and fundamentalist market reforms that forced many of them into such negotiations. Meanwhile, the sale of Russian oil to Europe, especially Germany, would fuel Russian militarism and its colonialist extremes. The drive of right-wing authoritarianism, fascism, and racism is clear. Indigenous groups within Russia have been disproportionately targeted for recruitment in the war, much more than ethnic Russians, and are also experiencing elimination because of this process. The genocide extends in multiple directions, not just in Russia, but in places like Brazil, that until recently under Bolsonaro saw ongoing threats to indigenous groups through displacement, killing of leaders, toxic mining, and of course, deforestation. In both cases, power-hungry actors resort or have resorted to environmental violations on a planetary scale. War itself is a carbon bomb, producing significant greenhouse gas emissions at a time when global efforts to fight the climate crisis cannot be undermined. But emissions from war are undercounted or not counted at all. So the war in Ukraine, in a larger sense, is better understood as deoccupation, as the Ukrainians themselves call it. Deoccupation from the legacies of Russian imperialisms and Cold War militarism, and by extension, the climate crisis. In order to face the latter, it is clear that cutting emissions, including those linked to the sales of Russian oil and natural gas, are critical. So I want to end on a note about transitional justice and reparations, since that is what we have also been asked to reflect on. It's hard to think that we have more case studies to fathom war's environmental costs. To consider the scale of reparations the U.S. owes Iraq and Vietnam, from the undetonated munitions and heavy metal contamination in Iraq to dioxin poisoning in Vietnam. War's toxic legacies evolve over decades. Inevitable uncertainties will add to the lag time of scientific analysis. Such realities are therefore stark reminders of the need for talking about reparations now. For Ukraine, that means stating the basic premise that others have stated, that this is a genocidal war meant to destroy Ukrainians as a people. And based on that premise, Russia owes Ukraine full reparations for the cost of the war, the destruction of people, nature, infrastructure, agricultural and industrial sectors, and more. Among other things, this means unconditional withdrawal of all forces and military equipment, including from nuclear facilities, and full respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity. It also means compensation for losses, both human and material, including the rebuilding of destroyed infrastructure, and those are just some to begin with. And even if you don't care too much about Ukraine, you might consider Chechnya, Georgia, and Syria, and the many people living in the peripheries of Russian militarized aggression who want to stop the impunity. And on this broader accountability effort, you can look at the work of the Reckoning Project. Finally, I think it's important to note that paying attention to other forms of colonialism, such as the Russian one, does not exonerate U.S. or Western militarism. It's just to say that in what is now sometimes called a multipolar world, there are multiple empires. We can't lose sight of the role of genocide in each of them, especially in the ones that openly declare genocide as an explicit policy goal. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce our second speaker. It's Elena Kim. She's a professor at the Department of Anthropology at UC Irvine in the United States. Her latest book, Making Peace with Nature, Ecological Encounters Along the DMZ, explores the ecological, cultural, and political transformations that have contributed to the DMZ's re-signification from a scar of fratricidal war to a green belt representing biodiversity and peace.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, I wanted to echo Adriana's thank you to the organizers for this wonderful opportunity to talk about, I think, what are connections between war and environments and ecologies that we were saying earlier have not really been fully examined, which is somewhat surprising. But at the same time, I think that it's all too obvious just looking at news coverage of whatever it is around the world, some of the biggest stories where we see, and this speaks directly to the way that Adriana just ended, wildfires and fires caused by explosives due to warfare. So it seems as if some of the ways in which we already know intellectually that environmentalism and warfare are deeply intertwined and have been for decades has become all the more obvious. So I'm going to speak about the topic of landmines and unexploded ordnance in South Korea. And my research has been really looking at the aftermath of war in South Korea. And Korea offers an interesting case because, as was just mentioned, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, which was created in 1953 as part of the armistice agreement that suspended but did not end the Korean War, is essentially a 4-kilometer wide buffer area that has been celebrated for, quote unquote, keeping the peace between the two Koreas. And in the 70 years that it's been in existence, it's turned into what many consider to be a sort of ironic outcome of war, which is a space of biodiversity. So the book and my research has examined this seemingly ironic and paradoxical space. But one of the larger points I make in my book is that if we consider capitalism and militarization as two of the world's largest world ordering processes, then it actually makes the DMZ not so ironic or surprising, because militaries require the isolation of space and the limiting of capitalist development. And in so doing, you have these so-called green zones. And you see this also in the territorial United States, where military bases require these kinds of buffer areas between suburban developments and their training grounds in order to keep the peace with their neighbors, with their civilian neighbors. And in those spaces, you end up having these accidental biodiversity hotspots. So that requires the U.S. Department of Defense to hire ecologists to monitor the endangered species that appear in these accidental green zones. So that's just one example of how the DMZ may seem very peculiar and idiosyncratic, but actually we can find many instances of this precisely because of these two processes of capitalism and militarization. But the thing I wanted to focus on was really this, what appeared to be at once ubiquitous and yet invisible during my fieldwork. So a lot of my research had to do with examining why it was that in South Korea, the DMZ's biodiversity had suddenly become representative of peace. And peace was a key word that was impossible to ignore when I was doing my fieldwork. And if any of you have gone to South Korea, visited the DMZ, or read about it in any way, you may notice that peace is a kind of discourse that has really attached itself to the DMZ. And the fact that rare and endangered species were discovered there starting in the 1990s really fueled a state project to associate nature with peace in one of the most heavily fortified and militarized places in the world. So doing my fieldwork in areas close to the DMZ, you would see mine signs and minefields. And on the one hand, the fact that there are 1 million mines within the DMZ and anywhere between 30,000 to 100,000 mines outside of the DMZ within South Korea makes mines actually one of the conditions that allows for the biodiversity to flourish, right? Because if you don't have human habitation, you have an sort of implicitly protected area. But as I did my fieldwork, particularly in areas where you had agricultural villages that had been populated in the DMZ area. So there's the DMZ proper, and then the areas immediately south of there, where you had villagers living since the 1960s within heavily mined regions of South Korea, largely unknown to most other citizens within the country. And these are farmers, rice farmers, agriculturalists who were moved back into this heavily militarized space in the post-war era in order to repopulate the part of the country that had been the site of the most intense battles between 1951 and 1953. So many of the mines that exist there in the mine fields were laid by U.S. military, but the demining had to be done by civilians. Civilians were told, you can, they were promised land in this area on the condition that they demined the territory. And so these are, there's a whole generation of Koreans living in these areas that are very, whose lives have been intimately affected by the death due to mines, by injuries due to mines, and who at least until about 2014 were largely uncompensated and unrecognized by the South Korean government. So when I was in one of these villages in 2011, I was speaking with a former mayor of this village who, considered me to be incredibly naive, particularly as a Korean American. And he, was explaining how it was because of U.S. policy around what's known as the Korea exception that South Korea lacked the sovereignty to manage its own mine problem. So on the one hand, you have South Korea sending money to places like Angola to help with mine removal, and on the other hand, they were ignoring the citizens in their very own country. So of course, I had to go home and figure out what was he talking about. He mentioned the fact that Bill Clinton had come to South Korea and told people, all the mines are located within the DMZ. So no child will be affected by mines, and so the Korea exception is essentially a U.S. policy that has existed since 1996, in which the U.S. government has, under pressure from the international community and the International Convention to Ban Landmines, agreed to do away with any so-called dumb mines and to only stockpile so-called smart mines. So smart mines are the ones that will self-destruct after a given period of time. But the Korea exception is one that argues that these so-called dumb mines are required for national defense in South Korea in the case of a North Korean invasion. And this Korea exception has been used as a justification for stockpiling, particularly anti-personnel landmines, and with the false assumption that mines don't exist outside of the DMZ in civilian areas. And in a sort of gruesome rhetorical turn, particularly around the late 1990s, you had representatives of the US military arguing that landmines were actually humanitarian because they were helping to prevent a future war with North Korea. So I'm out of time now, but the last thing I just wanted to mention to kind of wrap things up is as the DMZ's nature has been increasingly associated with peace and has been leveraged to expand ecotourism in the border area, you have a lot of new sites being developed for tourism related to the environment or ecology. But at the same time, there are increasing numbers of mine accidents, at least a handful every few years, precisely because of flooding due to climate change, right? Development into these areas that haven't been fully demined. And the last case that was recorded was actually in a so-called eco-village where investigators discovered a huge trove, a kind of, they called it like it was like a pit or even a tomb for mines, where local people would just move mines into this kind of dump because they didn't want to engage the military, which would create a minefield, make territory off limits, and make it impossible for them to earn a living. So these are all some of the convergences between militarism, environmentalism, and ecology that I've been studying. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our third and final speaker of the first group, I guess, will be Tam Ngo. She is a senior researcher at NIAD, and she is the leader of the research program entitled Bones of Contention, Technologies of Identification and Politics of Reconciliation in Vietnam, which is funded by the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research. And her research focus is on the role of religion and science in social healing, environmental reparation, and the politics of reconciliation in post-war context. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Good, almost evening, everyone. As Ken already make it impossible for me to hide, my research was not about environment, about ecology, or about the combination of war and environment. But I thought I didn't prepare this, but I want to share with you one special development that I feel very proud of, and also it will stay with me for a while. In 2021, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it happened to be the week also my children, I have 2 children, 8 years old then, was doing a school project on sustainability, on biological learning of how to live more clean and more effective, that the earth will stay healthy for them when they grow up. But that was also the week that, of course, the image on the media and the discussion in our city, well, I live in Nijmegen, and the Dutch call them the Havana Underworld, a city proud for its socialist tendency, and also we were very active in receiving refugees, and my children's school happened to be right next to the asylum seeker center in Nijmegen. So how to explain to children the bigger picture of the world that going in total chaos, at the same time how to not to dishearten them by the act of sowing a little seed and how to do the little gardening. So I come up with an idea that let's do the 2 things together, and we need to raise money to have the refugee. At that time we donate to an account, a national account. So we do a little project we call Planting for Peace. And for that project, every kid go home and take a little cutting from their home plants and put them in a pot and grow them until it become a new plant, and then they can auction it in that's before the King's Day. And we raised almost 600 euro, and that was something very nice. The school was very happy with it. We want to implement it further, but then the summer come and it's not good for rooting anymore. But there comes the question of how we can talk about peace, and we can talk about war, and we can talk about ecology all together. And I learned it from the language of 8 years old. These things are not exclusive of one another. They are combined. Now, my research up till this point mainly focused on the death, on war that happened before, on human loss and the human toll of this violence. And I didn't set out to study the environment, although my research is so embedded in it. So but it's unavoidable. So I stumbled up and on that. And here in this talk, I want to draw you to an example of war pollution. And I happen to come from Vietnam, so maybe some of you here have been, well, you surely heard of it, but in the last few years, there have been many global movement, and Europe is very active in it. The march against ecocide take place very close by here. So in this global march, the idea of ecocide is used as a way of gathering people, uniting people to fight against action that is happening that will render our environment unlivable for the future. So you can for this movement, for example, the deforestation of the Amazon, or the use of harmful chemicals, substance in industry or in warfare, or oil extraction and spill, or CO emission, or the agriculture in Holland, all can be denounced as an act of ecocide, and it should be criminalized at future genocide. I work at the NIOD, and there, many of my colleagues are experts in study of genocide of in the past. I insist, and I try to convince my colleague and my boss that it is time now we also should include in our portfolio study of ecocide. More specifically, with our expertise, we should pay attention to war in the past, and though that is still ongoing, like the Ukrainian and Russian war, that render our environment unlivable for decades, if not for centuries, after the war ends. The war that, as Adriana just mentioned, bring our planet to the threat of destruction. Now, I come from Vietnam. Well, here I'm proud to show you my national dress. For many young people in this country and also in the global north, the privileged west, and also in wealthy Asian country now, Vietnam is known as the next item on their ideal list, travel list to tropical paradise. But many of you here are also old enough to remember a burning Vietnam, a land under the reign of Agent Orange, a country that the United States wanted to turn into scorched earth. Ecocide, so in this movement that I just mentioned earlier, ecocide might appear novel to many people today, but it was actually a term coined and described what happened in Vietnam half a century ago. The person who coined this name was the American biologist and bioethicist Arthur Galston from the Yale University. In the 1950s, Galston had worked in a laboratory that developed various chemical components that could enhance agricultural production by way of using herbicide. In the 1960s, many of the chemicals he worked on were combined to produce Agent Orange, which then was used in Vietnam to destroy vegetation and poison communities on a massive scale. Appalled by the use of his creation, Galston became an anti-war activist and the first person to label massive destruction of ecosystem as ecocide. Galston devoted the rest of his life to use scientific argument for his activism against Agent Orange and ecocide. "50 years after the war ended, Agent Orange spray stripped the Vietnamese coast of 7.7 million acres of mangrove forest. It is still an important cause for coastal erosion, which makes coping with fast-rising sea level ever more arduous for many coastal communities in Vietnam. If the militarization and weaponization of the Korean DMZ, as Elena just shared with us here, gave nature a big boons, well, the fate of nature in the Vietnamese DMZ is much less rosy. Thanks to Agent Orange spray, stretches of hills in the DMZ region, as well as many other regions in central Vietnam and southern Vietnam, remain naked because nothing but wheat can grow there. For the Vietnamese people, Agent Orange inflicted pain on millions. Though directly exposed to dioxin, might contract multiple types of disease, from cancer to diabetes to Parkinson, while the descendants have high chance of suffering from severe disability. Vietnam government claimed 4.8 million victims, and 3 million of whom suffer severe health effects of Agent Orange. There are now up to 4 generations of victims in Vietnam. For all that we know, the intergenerational transmission of effect will continue. Worldwide, hundreds of thousands of Americans, South Koreans, Australian, and New Zealand veterans and their children are also experiencing health conditions linked to dioxin exposure. Despite warning of scientists in the past and increasing available scientific proof of harmful effects of Agent Orange, it took a long time for the US government to stop using it and to find a responsible way to dispose it. It took much longer time to admit responsibility toward its own soldiers who are affected by it, and again much longer time to admit its responsibility toward Vietnam. And now, only now, nearly 50 years after the war, the U.S. have finally began to have Vietnam to clean up territories contained by dioxin and also to give some financial aid to the Vietnamese Agent Orange victim. Till today, Agent Orange remains the most haunting legacy of the Vietnam War in both Vietnam and in the U.S. It is one of the best examples of environmental cost of violence. Its slow violence should prompt us, I argue, fast action against chemical warfare in particular and against war in general. Thank you.
We're going to have that awkward moment where our three presenters switch places with the next group coming up. I would encourage maybe you three to go down first so there's not a traffic jam. So thank you very much, and we will return to you during the Q&A in a few minutes. So if my other colleagues could join us, that would be lovely. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers in turn, as I did a moment ago, and our first one will be Darcy. And surprise, Darcy D'Angelo is a medical anthropologist with a training in sensory ethnography. Her area of focus is on landmine detection and its industries in Cambodia, especially those that work with animals as detection aids. She is dedicated to engaged studies and has conducted research in diverse fields from public mental health disparities on up to international policy. Welcome, Darcy.
Okay, I'm just also reflecting my thanks to the organizers, and I'm very excited about the workshop as it continues. Thank you. I normally talk about landmine detectors and their relationships to the new landmine detection companion animal, the rat. But I'm instead going to, for this kind of introduction, to think about the entanglements of pollution, climate change, and militarism and economy in Cambodia. I'm going to describe some stories that I from my encounters on minefield tours with landmine detectors themselves, to sort of describe how landmines, how it gets decided minefields get cleared in Cambodia, and how and who are the people clearing them. So minefields are always beautiful, is what I was told in Cambodia in 2015. I was told this by a platoon leader who was also a deminer. They're called platoons in Cambodia. And he was telling me this because I had remarked on how beautiful the minefield was. And he said, yes, when you are looking for landmines, you want to look especially carefully next to a stream, underneath a tree, because that is where the enemy will rest, and that is where the enemy will drink some water, and that is where you will find the landmines. And so I think there are three striking things about this story that he was telling me. First, I think it's interesting that to destroy your enemy, you must have empathy with them. You have to relate to your enemy, which is really at odds with the idea of dehumanization and the kinds of othering that we presume to happen with enmity. The next, that is the materialities of the landmines, the military waste in Cambodia, at least, are representing an endurance of war, that it doesn't go away even though it's after war has ended, because he still describes these people as enemies, even though there are no longer, the people who are hit by landmines are usually farmers and civilians. And the third is that the human is always in relation to their environment in some way. The human needs their environment. There's some sort of ecological system that they're embedded with. And so those are the three takeaways for me for that, that moment when this platoon leader struck me with this story, right? And he knew that landmines were planted that way because he had planted them himself as a soldier, which is a common trajectory in Cambodia, at least, for deminers who have histories in combat and often are, and the largest demining group in Cambodia is a military branch of government. The weather has changed in Cambodia, people also tell me. Cambodia, one deminer told me, used to only have one sky, Now there are many different skies. In Phnom Penh, this year it rains all the time, even though they do not need rain because they are not farmers. And in the countryside, there's no rain for farmers. We are all looking at the sky when he says this. The clouds are twisting into fantastic shapes and colors. The morning light paints them red and sometimes green or purple, depending on the level of rain weighing them down. I imagine the skies, as this deminer has described, a mosaic of multicolored atmospheres held together over the landmass of Southeast Asia. Why did it change? Because all the trees are being cut down. This is why we don't get as much rain. Surprises me when he says this because I know that he himself has been arrested for illegal logging. He has lost much of his fortune because of the arrest fines and other bad investments. He admits his logging without any sign of guilt, just regret that he lost so much money. But first he begins with a litany of different wood types in Cambodia with pride about them. Rosewood, teak, palm tree wood, rubber tree wood. He lists them with the pride that I cannot feel misses the ecological point that his logging destroyed these woods, and he says they are very rare, very expensive. But the state of the Cambodian environment and its threatened ecosystem comes within the first few sentences of most daily conversations I have now since conducting field work there in 2010. So at the sight of rain on the road, my taxi driver will call another driver 4 hours drives west, like he calls his friend, he says, "Hi, how are you? It's raining here. Is it raining there?" "It's not raining in Battambang," he announces to me and the other passengers. And then he said, and then the mother and sick child in the pack and the two men squished against each other in the 3 seats where this is a grad student, so I'm sharing a taxi. "Yes, all the trees have been cut down. We don't get as much rain," one of the men says. At the cash registers at stores and on motos behind drivers, I will say, "Oh, it's so hot." And they will say, "Yes, it is so hot. There aren't as many trees as there used to be." So even from the first time I was in Cambodia in 2010, the air is humid and the rain does not begin when it should in 2015. In 2010, the city of Battambang was nearly empty, a quiet little town known for artists and hidden gems of new Khmer modern architecture. Its air was never light and breezy, but every day in May it would rain in the afternoon, flooding the streets. Children would immediately jump out and play in accumulating puddles. Later on, 5 years later, the air weighs down on you. It feels like it should rain, but it never does. And instead, I feel downpours of sweat on my back, on my face, and between my breasts. My friend driving me on his motodop speeds over paved roads. I comment that the roads are getting more developed, and he said, "Yes, in Battambang there used to be mostly dirt roads, but now it's hotter because of the cement. They cut down many trees, and the cement makes it really hot. The sun heats it up, and we all bake." Local artists have published a zine that lists all the art galleries in Battambang, which I absent-mindedly pick up while drinking coffee and waiting for a friend. On the inside, a faded print of a photo of a Cambodian jungle behind some Khmer text, which reads, "The last nature reserve in Cambodia." Below it, in English, text reads, "Protect it or lose it." Beneath the English text, one giant humanoid figure with a skull for a head holds logs of trees in one hand. His skull has huge eyeballs and scary grinning teeth. The cartoon shows land separated by a river into 2 parts, a desolate sandy desert and a lush forest with a menagerie of jungle animals. The giant with the skull faces off a single pale human who wears a tiny cap and a skirt. The giant humanoid faces him with beringed fingers holding wads of cash and a suit jacket and a tie, although he seems to be rising from the earth as only his torso is visible. In front of him are relatively miniature human-sized figures with axes and guns who chop trees, point guns, and urinate on the living trees. One of the skull heads has a raft he is about to dip into the river. The message of the pamphlet posits loggers as divided from the menagerie of animals and their one human hero. They themselves have lost their humanity. And I wonder if this is the real meaning of what needs to be protected, a person's humanity, better found among the animals in the forest. So usually when anthropologists write about the kind of translation of the dichotomy nature-culture in Cambodia, it's Prai versus Srok. Even though it's not a dichotomy, it's actually a dialectic and a range between it's not mutually exclusive categories. So Prai is sort of wilderness and Srok is village. because so this is what when you go to minefields, you find out that mines are actually part of the prai. They're part of nature or wilderness because they cause the land to be uncultivatable, untamed, and wild. Usually, though, when you ask someone about environment, people will say tomachiat for nature or environment, which is actually dhamma, meaning dharma, the Buddhist truth of the universe, and chiat, which translates into existence or law. So tomachiat is the translation in NGOs too that also use it. So some of this could be from NGO talking. So even after the land has been so this is like, tomachiat also is used when NGOs name the word where people talk about landmine residues. So landmine residues are like in contrast with tomachiat. So even after land has been cleared of military waste, the waste always leaves some residue. There's traces of TNT or pollution in the dirt. But you also clear the land of the military pollution, making it cultivable, which is better for tomachiat. So the monk I speak to says that deminers are truly doing good work because all people must have land to cultivate. So according to this definition of the environment, tomachiat, the landmine clearance workers, the deminers, are actually environmental heroes. There is like this interesting thing, though, an interesting connection with the zine and the ghost and the ghost heads that Khmer people call. Okay, I'm going to skip to this idea that one minefield I visited was a clearing of a border road on a road called the King's Road, which leads to Thailand. No one makes any pretense that the road is being cleared for any reason other than the King's order. This was an emergency and clearing call, so it didn't go to bid, the head of the platoon explains. So usually you bid for mine clearance projects. It needed to be cleared quickly because the King wanted a road here. After we clear it, people can come in to pave the road. They hadn't found any landmines yet. Because the King wants this road developed, and because it's in a minefield area on a record map, they need to demine it as a matter of protocol, but it's ranked low in terms of how many mines are actually there. But all of the foreign visitors who were graciously invited to tour the minefield clearance, an African, a Briton, a Norwegian, and myself, an American, marvel at the amount of black birds with a brilliant orange stripe beneath each wing. The villagers alongside the road peer at us from their small wooden houses. Every third one or so sells bags of snacks, cotton gloves, and face masks. Someone asks out loud, but no one answers, and I wonder what will happen to the villagers when this road has paved, huh? They describe the step-by-step process for landmine clearance. First come the brush cutters. They will cut down the trees. Then they drive the massive mine-proof tractors with the whirring blades that cut up the underbrush, the roots, and shorter bamboo. One of these machines sits in front of in a mine clearance headquarters with scars of an explosion on its side. Second, the deminers will clear tracks in the minefield, whose borders are designated by a government baseline survey. And next, the deminers will stay in marked, cleared paths. Then they will each go one wide step at a time through the land with metal detectors. Each positive alert from the metal detector will get a red triangular flag on a wooden stake. The flags will be later the points for gentle digging. And finally, a separate team will detonate the landmine, and then the land will be available for development.
Thank you.
I'll just end there.
Our next speaker will be Sarah Wagner. She's a professor at George Washington University in the United States, and her research explores loss through the lens of war, memory, and prolonged mourning and uncertain death. She studies forensic responses to missing persons and has conducted ethnographic research in Bosnia and Herzegovina and with the U.S. military, including in Vietnam. Her most current research concerns COVID-19 death and remembrance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken and Tom and Dat, for hosting all of us. I look forward to tonight's conversation, but also all of tomorrow's. So I'll begin with a disclaimer. I'm not an environmental anthropologist, and my experience with multi-species ethnography is scant. I come to this subject instead through the lens of landscapes altered by the presence of the dead, from cemeteries to mass graves, from air crash locations to sites of detention, execution, and illicit disposal. I began my career in Bosnia and Herzegovina, studying the Srebrenica genocide and its more than 8,000 missing men and boys, where perpetrators sought to hide the traces of their crimes by returning to initial burial sites, digging up their contents, and scattering remains in a vast network of mass graves in eastern Bosnia. From Bosnia, I then turned to my own country's legacy of destruction and recovery through the example of the U.S. military's attempts to locate, repatriate, and identify its missing in action from the Vietnam War. If I thought much about land, the environment, through these two projects, it was largely as a site upon which humans labored, what they dug up in order to stash away and thus erase, what they unearthed in order to take back home. This roundtable and our discussions in the workshop tomorrow invite, at least for me, a closer look at how landscapes are more than simply backdrops or devices of human destruction. They are also ecosystems of memory making. In their record of rupture, scarring, and regrowth, they memorialize the very fact that wars don't end just because the people waging them have decided to declare peace. Now, in forensic anthropology and archaeology, there is the by now somewhat banal claim that graves tell stories. That is, tales of violence that the gaze of the forensic expert can decipher and in turn disclose to the apparatus of transitional justice and to wider publics. According to this framing, the detection work and reading of vegetation and soil I cannot do it. You know the strata, the soil, yeah, that. See, I'm not a forensic archaeologist either. It's probably a good thing. So this detection work and reading is of the vegetation. It's also of the bodies and their positioning within a mass grave, of their commingled and partial bones. All of that depend on specialized knowledge to interpret and relay truths. But in this framing, too, the landscape is still acted upon, requiring human intervention to give voice to the signs of atrocity. Now, there were more nuanced senses of human, non-human interconnectivity in the site of my initial fieldwork in Srebrenica, not expressed in such academic terms, but how people understood the region's intertwined fates of war and nature. When I first arrived to the city, I would walk up daily the mile-long cobblestone road that led to the former natural spring called the Guber. The steep hills that flanked the road had sections of recent new growth. During the 3.5 years of its existence as a UN safe area, supplies were short and refugees living in the enclave had taken to chopping down trees for fuel. Friends told me of how silent the forest seemed in the post-war years, even the birds they felt had fled the horrors of the place and not yet returned. Beyond these more obvious signs of the ecological impact of war, many of my interlocutors in Srebrenica and the Podrinja, this is the eastern part of Bosnia, also spoke of the landscape as irrevocably altered, no matter the regrowth, replenished wildlife, their own return to their land, to tending gardens and raising stock. Instead, the Podrinja's web of primary and secondary mass graves, the landscape of genocide, acted upon them. Driving past hills where victims sought shelter, valleys where they were taken captive, grave sites and exhumations a stone's throw from the roadside, fundamentally changed their relationship to that space, harboring as it did memories and imaginings of what had transpired and what the earth might still be hiding. Sometimes the landscape, however, refused to remain complicit in the campaign of genocidal erasure. A good friend of mine, Admir Jugo, a forensic anthropologist, archaeologist, who worked for the International Commission on Missing Persons, has written about the frantic task of exhuming remains from a reservoir in eastern Bosnia. In 2010, the Peručac Lake had to be drained because of repairs at the local hydroelectric plant. Once the water level dropped, the bones revealed themselves. Some 250 sets of remains were eventually recovered. victims from the Srebrenica July 1995 genocide, as well as missing persons from the Bosnian municipalities of Visegrad, Foča, and Goraže, as well as the Serbian cities of Priboj and Prijepolje, and even Kosovo. The Drina River, which feeds the lake, had long been the dumping grounds for Serbian and Bosnian Serb perpetrators. But in that summer of 2010, the water divulged its own truths, and a team of volunteers scrambled to assist Admir and his colleagues in gathering up as many of the bones as they could before the lake refilled. The contingent relationship between bodies of water and bodies of the disappeared isn't limited to Lake Peručac. In the 3 decades since the war's end, heavy rainfall and floods have repeatedly set the dead on the move, resurfacing their material remains and reanimating memories of the war. The effects of climate change with its extreme weather events add to the sense that the perpetrators' attempts to harness nature in an effort to conceal violence have their own environmental limits. If I were to return to Peručac, this beautiful lake nestled in the hills adjacent to the Drina River, I would wish to ask people, the people who swim in it, boat in it, fish in it, have barbecues on the shores, and look out on the glassy surface at the day's end, how the water feels to them, how the land itself remembers the horrors of what human beings had visited upon it. In short, I would want to ask how the landscape remembers and in turn shapes their own memories. Thank you.
Our next speaker is one of the co-organizers, Dat Nguyen. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the NIAD, and his ethnographic research focuses on religion, ethics, care, and war trauma in post-war late socialist Vietnam. His work specifically examines the intersections between religion and the commemoration of the fallen and missing in action soldiers in southern Vietnam, especially as it shapes discourses and practices of post-war remembrance and reconciliation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ken. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone, and it's a pleasure to have been working with Tom and Kent and organizing this workshop on this very important theme. And Tom and I wasn't planning on this at all today and what we're going to talk about, but actually her presentation set it up perfectly for what I wanted to address, which is one of the research lines that I've been developing in the last year or so has been to look at the issues of care and welfare and welfare for Agent Orange victims in Vietnam, and particularly the efforts by the Vietnamese government, but also U.S. AID in particular, in helping addressing the health and also environmental legacy of Agent Orange in Vietnam. And as Tom has alluded to earlier in her talk, the issues of Agent Orange is still a very big point of contentions in Vietnam-U.S. relationship. For the longest time after the war, U.S. basically denied a lot of the claims that were made by Vietnamese scientists and Agent Orange victims about the impact of Agent Orange on their health and the different incidences and high rates of disability in the country. And it wasn't until 2007 that the US and Vietnamese government found a new way to cooperate on this issue, and that is through the testing and remediation of dioxin hotspot at former US air bases. After sort of signing this agreement in 2006, the U.S. Congress started to allocate money to USAID so that they can contract it to to different Vietnamese partner in order to carry out these projects. And since in sort of from 2007 until 2010, the budget for USAID funding into Vietnam for Agent Orange, there was no division in terms of what this money can be used for. So it's basically both environmental remediation and healthcare all in one. But since 2011, when the budget was divided into two clear categories, so environmental remediations and health-related activities, the amount allocated to environmental remediation has remained considerably higher than the one dedicated to health and disability assistance. And up to this year, the total amount of money dedicated to environmental remediation is more than 2 times higher than that of health programs. So 336 million US dollars versus 139 million US dollars. And that's sort of baffled me a little bit. Why is that the case? And my speculations at this point, and this is something that also has been sort of shared by some of the experts who have worked in these fields, is that whereas health and disability programs are complex long-term affairs with many different forms of uncertainties and political sensitivities, environmental remediation at former U.S. air bases is a technical project that can have a date of completion, a concrete ways to measure success, for example, in the amount of soils remediated. This is not to say, though, that these environmental remediation projects are always predictable. Thus far, USAID and Vietnam's Ministry of National Defense has completed the remediation project in the Da Nang Air Base, which is in the central part of Vietnam, in 2018, and started the remediation project in Bien Hoa Air Base in the southern part of Vietnam in 2019. At the end of the Da Nang project, more than 90,000 cubic meters of contaminated soils and sediments have been treated. The Da Nang project, originally projected to be completed by 2013, received multiple increases in projected funding and further delay because of technical problems and new contaminated spot was being discovered. The project ended up taking 10 years, so from 2009 to 2018, and cost about 103 million USD. The project in Bien Hoa has been projected to take at least 10 years with the need to remediate 500,000 cubic meters of contaminated soil, so roughly more than 4 times that of the Da Nang project. So when you look at these figures, one can see that the environmental remediation projects are indeed costly, and that's probably one of the reasons why there's that sort of big difference in budgeting. What remains to be seen in the afterlife of these what remains to be seen, though, is the afterlife of the remediation projects. While there has been no in-depth report on the afterlife of the remediation project in Da Nang, the concluding report to this project says that the most immediate benefit of this project, and I'm quoting here, is that the remediated land can now be repurposed for productive uses, and specifically for the expansion of the Da Nang airport into territory that could not have been previously built upon. In 2022, the second cleanup project in Bien Hoa, even though it's still going, has resulted in an off-base lake and one on-base area being fully remediated. And while the lake has been returned to the community for use as a recreational area, the on-base area will have a U.S. government-funded park to commemorate the joint effort. What these shorter previews are telling me is that following these remediation projects, much of the soils and resources so far have been used to further capitalistic developments, recreational purposes, and commemorative projects. As such, there seems to be not too much intention on using these resources to improve community livelihood or to revitalize local ecologies. And particularly in the cases of Bien Hoa in the south, the air base is also now under the management of the Vietnam Ministry of Defense, with high walls erected to separate it from the rest of the local community. And so it would remain to be seen how the land inside Bien Hoa will be reincorporated into the local community, if at all. And while many people in Vietnam have applauded the U.S. commitment to environmental remediation, they urge the U.S. and Vietnam's government to focus even more on the human impact of it. And so to me, this is one of the difficult calculuses within the issues of Agent Orange. How can we address both the environmental legacies and human health problems without continuing an overly anthropocentric framing, so human costs, interests versus the environment? How can we redesign and expand environmental remediation projects to include humans and other species to go beyond the purely capitalistic and economic development-centric afterlife of these projects? Right, thank you.
we have one last speaker. We saved the best for last, and she will be very brief, she promises. So I'd like to invite up Hinky Piersma. She's the head of research and the deputy director of NIOD. Her research, previously focused on Dutch war criminals, now concerns the spoliation of Jews during the Second World War and their legal restoration. I believe she just has a few quick comments for us in response.
Yeah, I'll keep it very short because I am not an expert on all of the things said here. I'm from NIOD. As Ken said, I want to first of all thank Tom, Dot, and Ken for inviting me. I'm at NIOD head of the department, of the research department, and we are, because of the recent climate crisis, no, not so recent, but we are developing right now a program to see how we can make a new research line on environment and violence, slow violence, war. It's not in our comfort zone. I'm an historian, and a lot of colleagues are historians too. So we like to engage with things in the past and not things that are happening right now. But I think we have to come out of our comfort zone. And I think it's also important to have to work with a lot of other scientists from different backgrounds. So I'm here the only historian, I think, but at least in the panel. Ken, you're a historian? No? No, yeah.
I do history, but I'm not a card-carrying member of the guild.
No, but I think that's important, and I also would love to work with not only with anthropologists, but also with biologists. Difficult word for me, and I want to point have your attention for a new research center in Leeuwarden up north. It's Bird's Eyes, and actually my brother is working there, and he's a biologist. And I think it's very important to work with them also, because they are looking at birds and migrating birds, and you can see how the behavior of these birds influence exactly all of the world, and they are like I don't know the English word, parkieten. Parrots. Yeah, parrots, of course. The parrots of the climate crisis. So I would love to work not only with my brother, but also with this center. So yeah, we are working on a program. I think it's important. As you hear, I'm very humble at this theme. I am much more confident to talk about war criminals, but it's not the topic of today. Well, that's it. And have a very nice conference tomorrow, and I think we hear the results. And okay, one last word to Tom, because she said that I'm her boss. Well, it's just a role I play, and but I think it's very important to look on ecocide, and that it's part of our research lines at NIOD. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to begin by acknowledging a fundamental weakness of this workshop. As Inga pointed out, I think every last one of us is an anthropologist. And that surely speaks to some serious shortcomings in whoever planned this workshop, because the topic is not reducible to cultural perspectives. But I think it's really important as we move to the question session to explore what ethnographic sensibilities can bring to these issues that have been too long dominated by political scientists, by lawyers, by climate scientists, and perhaps most notably, insurance companies. So I like to believe, and hopefully my colleagues agree, that we can bring something else of note and value to the conversation. And we'll get back to you on Friday and let you know if we succeeded. But while you're pondering your questions, I had a sort of a general opening question to the panel as a whole. And then I'm hopefully going to be quiet and let them talk amongst themselves and then invite you to join us as a group. And that is, I'll start with the Cold War. This workshop had many different titles, one of which was War Pollution and Its Legacies. And listening to our various case studies from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from Ukraine, from the two Koreas, from Bosnia-Herzegovina, they're all in one way or another profoundly shaped through the Cold War and what we often call its legacies. But what we really haven't done, in my view, is actually taken up the concept of legacies and really thought carefully about what we mean. Because legacies, they have residues, as one of you mentioned. They have physical traces on the landscapes. They have genetic repercussions across generations. And they, of course, leave emotional scars that can reverberate down through time. Those are all legacies, but they're very, very different. There's also the question of continuities and discontinuities over time and space. What was an issue disappears and then may reassert itself, like dead skeletons emerging out of a lake that's being drained for climate change issues. We have hauntings. We have different times. We have human times. We have religious and mythical time and ecological time, and perhaps others I'm not naming. So my question to the panel is, if you think about the Cold War and this concept of legacies as it relates to either what you spoke about today or what you'll be speaking about over... Oh, thank you. Thank you. I feel special. Over the course of the workshop, I'm sort of curious how you would, from either an analytical point of view or a methodological point of view, go about unpacking, if it were, this concept of legacies and how it relates to the material you work with.
I guess I'll go first, although I guess I'm not in the legacy bucket exactly because this is an ongoing war. But what I can say about legacies is that, I think we often focus on the uncertainties of legacy, especially with regard to scientific knowledge. Of course, in my work on the Chernobyl aftermath, it seemed like the further and further you got from the event, the more it disappeared into the bodies of people. You didn't even know how to read the legacy anymore in the bodies. And of course, people remember and they know and they have stories, they have memories. So I think one of the things that I've learned just hearing everybody and thinking about Ukraine, which I have not been to for a long time now. I've done other work. But I think we can sort of say there are certainties in legacies, and those are concerning the way in which we think about science and accountability, that we have to bring these sort of deep time dives that we did with legacy back into the present and create more robust systems of accountability, given the fact that there will be uncertainty, and we have to be able to respond more adequately in the moment of violence. And I think that's what we're learning over and over again, that when we don't, we have a legacy, unfortunately.
Great, thank you.
I can speak a little bit about the paper that I offered the group for our two-day conference, which I didn't speak about just now. But one of the things that I'm interested in is speaking specifically to this point about the Cold War and its legacies, is the ways in which certain kinds of scientific practice and epistemology can also be seen threaded through some of the ways in which we even understand ecologies. So the paper that I presented to the group is really about how, interestingly, the Korean DMZ had been identified in the 1960s by American and South Korean scientists as a potential haven of biodiversity. So that might be surprising to us from our vantage point, sort of presentists like, well, we care about ecology, but, of course they didn't back then. But yes, they did. And they were reading the DMZ through the relatively new science of ecosystems. But under that paradigm, the idea was that the ecosystem could be interpreted or studied as a bounded space. And so the fact that the DMZ was a bounded space was very intriguing to scientists in the mid-century. And so it was actually the first study of the DMZ's ecologies took place under the auspices of the Smithsonian Institution. And they sent scientists over in ways that really did two things. One was try to use the DMZ as a place to actualize this new science of ecosystems at a moment when the US was ascending globally, right? And also kind of creating this idea of international science, which is very much a Cold War project. So there are a lot of interesting convergences around identifying the DMZ and actually defining it at that moment. So one of the things that I found in the archive were, the supposedly neutral scientists of the Smithsonian also framing the DMZ as a kind of positive outcome of the Korean War, right? So already you see the ways in which a certain version of history is being entwined or entangled with notions of science, which is also a social and cultural phenomenon. So I think to me, that's a really important legacy of how we think about the DMZ today as a space of biodiversity, right? And some of the tensions that were very apparent from the archive between the American scientists and the South Korean scientists kind of played into this, because for a lot of the South Korean scientists who were of the first generation in the post-colonial and post-war moment, for them, the DMZ presented a potential opportunity to collaborate with their North Korean counterparts, right? Whereas for the American scientists, that was not at all what they imagined the space could do. So for them, it was about the DMZ providing data for universal science, which did not at all include North Korea or other parts of the so-called international community. So that's just one sort of specific way in which I can.
Great. Thank you. You don't have to speak unless you want to.
Well, it's very relevant, the legacies of the Cold War to the conflicts in Southeast Asia, partly because the U.S. and the Soviet Union were funding a lot of the weaponry, and that's where a lot of the military waste comes from. You also have the anti-communist and the communist regimes that were emerging there. Although, from the perspective of the ground, it is mostly the U.S.'s war with Vietnam, and then Maoist communism movements, which are I would suggest that we need to reframe it from Cold War U.S. versus Russia, because it's a bit Eurocentric to frame it in such a way. I think from the perspective in Southeast Asia, it's much more about the other geopolitics. But I would say there's legacies in terms of relationships, and what I would try to say with this paper is not that all the deminers are these bad guys, but actually the deminers are hustlers, and they need to fend for themselves, and a lot of that means crossing ethical lines, and part of that is a legacy of war. Part of that is a legacy of knowing that anyone can switch sides at any moment, so you need to make sure that you're able to take care of yourself and your family, and so sometimes that entails logging, and sometimes that entails demining, and that's a legacy of war.
And I think from my perspective, so the questions of legacy in the context of the whole Agent Orange debate, comes up very strongly when you think about the sort of bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Vietnam. And so I just came back from a research trip in D.C., and sort of my research trip sort of coincided with the announcement of Vietnam and U.S. upgrading their partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership, right, which is the highest form of friendship, right, that the two nations can have. And I mean, when I was in D.C., there was a lot of excitement and fervor from the U.S. side about it. And then of course you also see the Vietnamese delegation, and they were like, okay, well, what does that mean for you supporting us in terms of addressing war legacy, right? So the question of legacy emerges as a point of, I like to use the term attachment. So I mean, it is a way for the two countries to sort of attach a lot of important diplomatic bilateral negotiation into addressing the issues of war legacy. It plays a big part in U.S. and Vietnam reconfiguring their relationship, and what the U.S. also had to think in relation to the expansion of China, for example, in the region, right? So those are the ways in which the Cold War legacy and the reworking of Cold War legacy emerge in the whole debate about Agent Orange.
Well, for me, to start with, I think we have to remember that the Vietnam War, or the war against America and Vietnam, is a hot war of the Cold War. So there's nothing cold about it. And all the things that happened from landmine to Agent Orange come from the fact of the world divided, and Vietnam happened to be in the middle of it. And legacy in the case of war pollution in Vietnam is multifolded, multi-level, multi-generational. It is impossible to explain to you here, and I think it do injustice to the issues. But I want to draw your attention to what that said, that at this very moment, where Vietnam and the U.S. embrace each other as the next brother of kins, and that one cannot have to be skeptical about how against it is geopolitical reason that bring about this new relationship, and it was a geopolitical reason that bring about the Vietnam War. So I don't know whether I would want to cry or I want to smile when this news was announced, but I want that moment, the attention is not taken away from the life of the millions of Vietnamese who are still pending in their question what happened to them, to their body, where science, so in Vietnam, the case of Agent Orange is a new testing field for scientific exchange, for the exploration of human knowledge about what we did to our bodies. And when scientists cannot agree with each other, and this is another legacy of Cold War, the US refused to accept scientific research finding from Vietnam because in the past it was influenced by Russian way of doing research. Currently, these findings were not published in a ranking journal in the West, so therefore they are not to be taken serious. So there, the legacy of Cold War and Cold War division and scientific knowledge continued. But then again, this is the life of people who live the real live experience of that legacy, and that is a legacy itself.
Thank you.
I feel like I have to say something.
You do. You want dinner?
Yeah, that's not right. I'm hungry, so I'll bite. In the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, I think about legacy not simply as post-Cold War, but really post-World War II. And we had a little of the framing of transitional justice, but legacy in Bosnia and Herzegovina is inflected with agendas of transitional justice. And so, the unearthing of mass graves and the identification of missing persons had, a purported aim of achieving social repair. And if nothing else, we see the legacy of that is complicated, unexpected, that has thwarted in many ways these international sponsors' aims. That Admir, my friend, ended up with a team of volunteers scrambling to get remains is not because the system of transitional justice of, investigating mass graves had actually worked. It was sort of this fluke of a breakdown of the hydrothermal plant. So I wanted to make that point. And the other, I literally taught last night to my class on war and memory, Primo Levi's Se questo è un uomo. And he has this preface, and the very last line is, "It seems unnecessary for me to state," and I'm getting this a little bit wrong, "that these events are not invented," right? That the facts of what he will chronicle are not invented. That he wrote that in 1958, that I think about Srebrenica and this slow move, what Hikmet Karčić will call a mainstreaming of denialism, has such a force that Srebrenica, these mass graves, these bodies, didn't exist. You know, that seems so antithetical to the legacy that an international community sponsoring DNA technology, sponsoring these international criminal tribunals sought to achieve. And so, if nothing else, legacy, and to me, it's like it's up in the air if legacy is supposed to intimate truth and certainly repair and reconciliation in the region.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left, and I'd like to invite the audience, if they have any questions, to raise your hand. Wonderful.
Thank you very much. Me first, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. All presenters did an amazing job. It was depressing, but they were all very insightful. And I really like what Adriana said about how the kind of rituals of safety are replacing international standards of human rights, war crime, accountability. Of course, we know that these are all arbitrary in some ways, but what I have been also hearing in these different talks is this kind of emergent forms of rituals of peace, right? Rituals of the kind of repackaging demilitarized zones as kind of sources of biodiversity, humanitarian mines, or all this kind of science and technology of rethinking these, or this kind of nuclear promises to fight against climate change. So like bringing it back to the question of transitional justice, social repair, environmental reparation, then how are we gonna rethink these questions in the midst of all these new emerging rituals of peace? Thank you.
Shall we take the second question too, and then you can answer as you see fit?
Thank you. First, my name is Tatiana. I'm from Ukraine. I'm here from September to do research on war environmental interaction in NIAS, and this is why I'm very grateful for opportunity to be here and to hear the very interesting and important talks about war impacts on different aspects of human life and environment, because these two issues, human life and environment, are closely connected between each other. And my question is, question and thought about this war. I mean, current Russian-Ukrainian war has many common features with other wars, like war in Vietnam, in Balkans war, and other wars took place after the Second World War. But it has a lot of new specific features, because, first of all, because of its scale and global environmental impacts on climate change. And each kind of experience of rethinking and assessment of war consequences are important for us. But my question is, how can we assess the global impacts of this war, and what could be our actions to overcome these impacts?
Thank you. Anyone want to start on the rituals of peace, and then we can shift to Ukraine?
unfortunately, that takes me in a different direction insofar as I won't talk about Bosnia. I'll talk about COVID-19, which may sound absolutely like we're in left field now. But I lead a project that's literally called Rituals in the Making. In the United States, there is an essentially deafening silence at the national level, recognizing the 1,200,000 people who died of COVID. And so rituals, like the ritualistic care of bodies, of grave sites, of memories has fallen to surviving families, to localities. Maybe if you're lucky, there's a state that might have a memorial. And so one of the things that we've tried to do in this process of documenting rituals is to assess what becomes efficacious. Like one of the anthropologists, because they're all anthropologists on the team, is a linguistic anthropologist who continually reminds us to ask the question, what is efficacious, right? With this ritual activity, what does that movement, that activity, that coming together do for people? And so I think sometimes letting go of the assumption that the nation is going to take care. I mean, I studied the US military for a decade and how they care for war dead. And maybe that's helped me see that this ritual activity in its efficacy is potent as when people have decided to grasp it from the state.
We're over time, but I want to see if anyone has a brief response to the very important question about Ukraine. Or we can carry it over if you wish as people leave. Maybe some of the panelists can stay back and speak to you directly. That's another option, because I know, okay.
The carbon costs of war are notoriously not estimated. So as I, hear about deforestation, loss of mangroves in the other wars that have been discussed, I ask, what is the climate cost of war? And so I don't think Ukraine is exceptional in that sense. I think what we need to do with these, understandings of war now is to understand how these war ecologies synthesize with climate change accelerations, to offer less and less protection. And that, I think, needs to be studied. Those synergies need to be studied. We also just need to, there's been a study in Ukraine, actually, I think there was a study recently done on the carbon costs of war in Ukraine, and I believe it was one of the first to actually kind of use satellite monitoring to look at the number of fires, the emissions from fires, from oil depots and explosions. And you have to wonder what happened in the other wars that we've discussed. But we have to think synergistically now and rethink the senses of, as we are, the urgencies of responding to war ecologies, but in the context of a climate crisis in which we have little borrowed time at this point. So,
can I just add one thing? And I don't know if you're aware, but apparently last year at the COP27, the Ukrainian Minister of the Environment had a presentation where he explicitly connected genocide and ecocide. Right, and had the actual projected greenhouse gas emissions, not just from the war, but from reconstruction. And that was I thought it was such an incredible moment because it forced the international community to say, yeah, we need to actually measure the cost, the climate cost of war. But at the same time, I'm very much concerned that other observers are saying that because of the climate crisis, there'll be an increasing number of conflicts, right? So these two sort of inexorable processes are converging in ways that I think are just so unpredictable. Of course, if we could all get together and agree that war is actually contributing to the destruction of a habitable planet, that would be a ritual of peace that I would join. But we don't see that happening yet. And, I'm finding it really, despairing, actually, that the next COP is going to be hosted and actually, the president of the next COP is, also the head of the UAE's oil regime. So it's just a really sort of stark moment where we see the operations of power really moving in the wrong direction.
Thank you. On behalf of all the workshop participants and the NEOD more generally, we want to thank all of you for taking time out and joining us this evening. We hope it was informative and interesting, and we want you to, despite the topic, enjoy your evening. And before you leave, please join me in thanking the panelists for sharing their thoughts with us this evening.